The emergency alert system shrieked through the sprawling Nevada training facility at exactly 3:47 a.m. But Dr. Sarah Chen didn't flinch. She'd been awake for the past 6 hours anyway, meticulously cataloging the deliberately sabotaged equipment. They'd assigned her for tomorrow's disaster response simulation. Every piece of gear bore subtle but critical flaws that would ensure failure under pressure. The carbon monoxide detectors had been recalibrated to show false readings. The portable generators had loose fuel lines that would cause power failures at crucial moments. The emergency medical supplies were outdated, with expired medications and faulty 4 lines that would collapse under standard pressure. They wanted her to fail spectacularly, and they'd gone to considerable lengths to guarantee it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Chen had perfected the art of professional mediocrity. At 34, she navigated the bureaucratic maze of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's regional office in Carson City with the calculated precision of someone who understood that competence, properly managed, could be both blessing and curse. Her cubicle in the basement level of the government building reflected this philosophy perfectly. Functional desk, standard issue computer, a single photo of her deceased parents, and absolutely nothing that might suggest she possessed capabilities beyond her official job description as a mid-level emergency preparedness coordinator. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah reviewed routine paperwork for county-level disaster preparedness assessments. Forms in triplicate, budget allocations for emergency supplies, training schedules for local first responders who treated. Federal oversight as a necessary annoyance. It was mind-numbing work that required just enough attention to prevent mistakes, but never enough to showcase actual expertise. Her supervisor, Deputy Director Richard Hoffman, appeared at her cubicle entrance with the self-satisfied expression of someone delivering news he expected would cause distress. Hoffman had spent his entire career climbing the federal bureaucracy ladder through political connections rather than competence, and he harbored a particular resentment for employees whose qualifications exceeded his own. "Chen," he announced without preamble, "you've been selected for the Joint Military-Civilian Emergency Response Exercise at Nellis Range next week. Consider it an opportunity to represent our agency's capabilities." Sarah looked up from her paperwork with carefully controlled neutrality. The Nellis exercises were legendary within emergency management circles, not for their effectiveness, but for their tendency to humiliate civilian agencies in front of military brass. FEMA coordinators returned from these simulations with damaged reputations and career prospects that never quite recovered. "I assumed this assignment wasn't voluntary," she replied evenly. Hoffman's smile widened. "The Pentagon specifically requested experienced personnel from our regional office. Your name came up during the selection process." The way he emphasized your name made it clear that her selection had been anything but random. For the past 3 years, Sarah had maintained a careful balance of competence and invisibility within the agency. She completed assignments efficiently, but never spectacularly. She offered suggestions during meetings, but never pushed hard enough to make colleagues feel inadequate. Most importantly, she avoided any situation that might require her to demonstrate capabilities that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. That background included training and experience that existed in files with security classifications far above Hoffman's clearance level. But as far as her official FEMA record indicated, Dr. Sarah Chen was a disaster preparedness coordinator with a master's degree in emergency management and 5 years of unremarkable service coordinating supply distribution and training programs. "When do I leave?" she asked, already knowing that declining wasn't really an option. "Transport leaves Monday morning. You'll have 72 hours to review the exercise parameters and prepare your response protocols." Hoffman placed a thick folder on her desk. The scenario involves a simulated chemical plant explosion with multiple casualties, infrastructure damage, and potential environmental contamination. Standard multi-agency response coordination. Sarah opened the folder and began scanning the exercise outline. What she read confirmed her suspicions. The simulation was designed to overwhelm civilian emergency management capabilities while showcasing military efficiency and preparedness. FEMA coordinators would be given impossible timelines, insufficient resources, and conflicting information that would virtually guarantee failure. "Interesting challenge," she said diplomatically. "I'll do my best to represent the agency professionally." "I'm sure you will," Hoffman replied, but his tone suggested he was counting on exactly the opposite outcome. After he left, Sarah continued reading through the exercise documentation. The more she studied the scenario, the more obvious it became that civilian participants were being set up as scapegoats. The chemical plant explosion simulation included complications that would strain even highly experienced emergency response teams. Mass casualties requiring immediate triage and evacuation. Infrastructure damage that would complicate transportation and communication. Environmental contamination requiring specialized equipment and expertise that most civilian agencies couldn't provide. But what really caught her attention were the equipment allocation lists. Military units would have access to state-of-the-art gear, redundant communication systems, and specialized vehicles designed for exactly these types of scenarios. Civilian coordinators would be given outdated equipment, limited communication capabilities, and transportation that was barely adequate for routine operations. Sarah had participated in enough real disasters to recognize a rigged game when she saw one. The question was whether to play along with their expectations or risk exposure by demonstrating capabilities that might raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. That evening, she sat in her small apartment reviewing files that officially didn't exist. Documents sealed in waterproof containers and hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom closet. Photographs from operations in places that didn't appear on any public map. Commendations for service in situations that were classified at levels requiring congressional oversight to discuss. Dr. Sarah Chen's official biography was accurate but incomplete. She did have a master's degree in emergency management, earned during a brief civilian interlude between military assignments. She had worked for FEMA for 3 years, though her motivation for taking the position had more to do with seeking anonymity than building a career in emergency management. What her official file didn't mention was her previous role as a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense specialist with the Army's 20th Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, Explosives Command. She'd spent 8 years developing response protocols for weapons of mass destruction incidents, training elite military units in containment and decontamination procedures, and personally leading response teams in situations where failure would have resulted in mass casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. Her expertise in emergency response wasn't theoretical. It had been tested in places where chemical weapons were deployed by hostile forces, where nuclear materials had been weaponized by terrorist organizations, where biological agents threatened to create pandemic-level casualties. She developed innovative decontamination techniques that were now standard protocol for military CBRN units worldwide. But that career had ended abruptly when political changes at the Pentagon resulted in budget cuts for specialized programs. Her unit was disbanded, her expertise was deemed no longer strategically relevant, and she was offered the choice between reassignment to conventional military roles or honorable discharge with full benefits. Sarah had chosen discharge, partly because the reassignment options didn't interest her, but mostly because she'd grown tired of operating in environments where lives depended on decisions made by people who'd never faced the consequences of being wrong. She'd wanted normal problems, predictable challenges, and the luxury of making mistakes that wouldn't result in mass casualties. Working for FEMA had seemed like a reasonable compromise. Emergency management still involved helping people during disasters, but the stakes were generally lower and the political pressures more manageable. She could use her skills to make meaningful contributions without constantly operating under the pressure of preventing national security catastrophes. The irony wasn't lost on her that 3 years of deliberate mediocrity had led to being selected for an exercise designed to showcase her inadequacy. Hoffman and his Pentagon contacts clearly expected her to fail publicly, providing justification for further marginalization of civilian emergency management agencies. Sarah closed the classified files and returned them to their hiding place. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for an exercise that was designed to humiliate her and her agency. The smart play was to meet expectations, fail professionally, and return to Carson City with her cover intact and her anonymity preserved. But as she looked through her apartment window at the lights of the city below, she found herself thinking about the people who would be affected by future disasters. Real emergencies where civilian coordination could mean the difference between effective response and catastrophic failure. Training exercises like the Nellis simulation weren't just bureaucratic games. They shaped policies and procedures that would be implemented during actual disasters. If civilian agencies were systematically undermined and marginalized, who would coordinate response efforts when military resources weren't available? Who would bridge the gap between federal capabilities and local needs? Who would ensure that emergency management remained focused on saving lives rather than showcasing military superiority? Sarah had spent 3 years avoiding these questions. Content to process paperwork and attend meetings while more ambitious colleagues fought battles over budgets and protocols. But the Nellis exercise represented something larger than personal career management. It was a test of whether civilian emergency management agencies deserve to exist as independent entities or should be absorbed into military command structures. The decision she faced wasn't just about maintaining her cover or preserving her anonymity. It was about whether her knowledge and experience could serve something larger than personal security. She'd learned techniques and developed expertise that could revolutionize civilian emergency response capabilities. But using that knowledge would mean stepping back into a world of high stakes, decision-making and public scrutiny that she'd worked to escape. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the FEMA office early and began researching everything she could find about previous Nellis exercises. Official reports painted a consistent picture of civilian agency inadequacy and military superiority. But, reading between the lines, she noticed patterns that suggested the outcomes were predetermined rather than performance-based. Equipment failures that occurred with suspicious frequency among civilian teams. Communication breakdowns that seemed to affect only non-military participants. Scenario complications that emerged precisely when civilian coordinators were making progress. Sarah had participated in enough legitimate training exercises to recognize sabotage when she encountered it. The question was whether to document these patterns and prepare countermeasures, or to accept failure as the path of least resistance. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Patricia Walsh, Exercise Director for next week's simulation. Would you be available for a brief call to discuss your role in the upcoming training scenario?" Sarah stared at the message, recognizing both opportunity and danger in the request. Contact from the Exercise Director could provide valuable intelligence about what she would be facing. But it also meant that military leadership was taking unusual interest in a mid-level FEMA coordinator who was supposed to be just another civilian participant. She called the number and was connected immediately. "Dr. Chen, thank you for calling. I wanted to personally welcome you to next week's exercise and ensure you have everything needed for effective participation." Colonel Walsh's voice carried the professional courtesy that military officers used when addressing civilian colleagues they were required to work with, but didn't necessarily respect. Sarah had heard that tone countless times during her military career, though usually from the other direction. Thank you, Colonel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm looking forward to the learning opportunity. Excellent. I should mention that this particular simulation has been designed to test emergency response capabilities under extremely challenging conditions. We're implementing scenario complications that previous exercises haven't included. I want to ensure all participants understand the level of difficulty they'll be facing. Sarah interpreted the warning correctly. Colonel Walsh was giving her advance notice that the exercise would be particularly brutal for civilian participants. Whether this was professional courtesy or psychological warfare remained to be seen. I appreciate the heads up, Colonel. Can you provide any specific guidance about equipment or preparation requirements? All necessary equipment will be provided on site. Participants should focus on reviewing standard emergency response protocols and ensuring familiarity with interagency coordination procedures. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Sarah learned nothing that wasn't already apparent from the documentation. The exercise was designed to overwhelm civilian capabilities while showcasing military preparedness. She would be given inadequate resources and expected to fail publicly. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her cubicle staring at the exercise folder. Everything she'd learned confirmed her initial assessment. This was a setup designed to justify predetermined conclusions about civilian agency inadequacy. The smart response was to play along, fail professionally, and return to anonymity. But as she considered that option, she found herself thinking about her former teammates in the 20th CBRN Command. People who'd trusted her expertise in situations where mistakes meant mass casualties. Who'd relied on her ability to develop solutions when conventional approaches weren't sufficient. Those teammates deserved better than watching civilian emergency management capabilities being systematically undermined by political games and bureaucratic power plays. The American people deserved emergency response coordination that prioritized effectiveness over institutional rivalries. Sarah opened her computer and began research in chemical plant disaster scenarios, not from the perspective of a mid-level FEMA coordinator, but with the analytical rigor of someone who'd spent years developing response protocols for weapons of mass destruction incidents. If they wanted to test her capabilities under extreme conditions, she would give them a demonstration they wouldn't expect, but she would do it carefully, revealing just enough competence to achieve mission success without exposing expertise that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. The weekend before departure, Sarah packed methodically for the Nevada exercise. Standard civilian emergency management gear, basic personal items, and nothing that would suggest capabilities beyond her official job description. But she also spent hours reviewing specialized techniques and protocols that existed only in classified military manuals. She wouldn't use any equipment or methods that couldn't be explained by civilian training and experience. But she would apply them with precision and effectiveness that might surprise people who expected her to fail. Monday morning arrived with the crisp desert air that characterized Nevada in early spring. Sarah joined the FEMA team at the Carson City airport, where a military transport was waiting to ferry civilian participants to Nellis Air Force Base. Her colleagues seemed nervous about the upcoming exercise, clearly aware of the agency's poor track record in previous simulations. "Try not to embarrass us too badly," joked Tom Martinez, a senior coordinator who'd participated in similar exercises before. "These military guys love making us look incompetent." Sarah nodded sympathetically while privately noting that Tom's defeatist attitude was probably contributing to the agency's reputation for inadequacy. He was expecting to fail before the exercise even began, which virtually guaranteed poor performance regardless of actual capabilities. The flight to Nellis took less than 2 hours, but the change in environment was dramatic. Instead of fluorescent-lit government offices, they were entering a world of military precision and efficiency. Everything from the aircraft to the base facilities reflected an organizational culture that prioritized performance over bureaucratic process. As they disembarked, Sarah noticed several military personnel observing the civilian arrivals with expressions that ranged from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain. She recognized the looks from her own military experience, the way elite units evaluated outsiders who were about to be tested beyond their capabilities. Colonel Walsh met them at the transport terminal, her bearing reflecting both command authority and the confidence of someone who'd run these exercises many times before. Welcome to Nellis, ladies and gentlemen. Over the next 72 hours, you'll be participating in our most challenging emergency response simulation to date. I trust you're prepared for some intensive learning. The group was escorted to a briefing facility where they received detailed information about the upcoming scenario. As Sarah suspected, the chemical plant explosion simulation included complications that would strain even experienced response teams. Multiple casualty sites spread across a wide geographic area, infrastructure damage that would complicate transportation and communication, environmental contamination requiring specialized equipment and procedures. But what really caught her attention was the equipment allocation briefing. Military units would have access to advanced detection equipment, specialized vehicles, and communication systems with redundant backup capabilities. Civilian teams would be given basic gear that was adequate for routine emergencies, but insufficient for the level of complexity they'd be facing. Questions? Colonel Walsh asked after completing the scenario briefing. Sarah raised her hand. Colonel, the equipment list seems somewhat limited given the scope of the scenario. Will civilian teams have access to additional resources if initial allocations prove insufficient? Walsh's expression remained professionally neutral, but Sarah caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise at the question's directness. Dr. Chen, the exercise is designed to test response capabilities under resource constraints that reflect real-world limitations. Additional equipment requests will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, but participants should plan to work within allocated parameters. Translation: they would be given broken or inadequate equipment and expected to fail without support. That evening, Sarah reviewed the gear she'd been assigned for the exercise. As expected, every piece of equipment bore subtle but critical flaws that would cause problems under pressure. The detection equipment had been calibrated incorrectly, the communication devices had limited range and poor battery life, and the protective gear showed signs of deliberate sabotage. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure her failure. Sarah had faced sabotaged equipment before, during military exercises designed to test adaptability under impossible conditions. The key was recognizing the limitations early and developing workarounds that didn't depend on functioning gear. She spent the night studying the scenario details and developing contingency plans for every piece of equipment she expected to fail. By morning, she had alternative approaches for detection, communication, and protection that would function even if her assigned gear proved completely unreliable. The exercise was scheduled to begin at dawn, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and focus that preceded high-stakes operations. For 3 years, she'd avoided situations that might require her to demonstrate capabilities beyond civilian expectations. Now she was walking directly into an environment designed to test exactly those capabilities. But as she prepared for what might be the most challenging 72 hours of her civilian career, Sarah found herself looking forward to the opportunity. Not because she wanted recognition or vindication, but because she'd finally have a chance to prove that civilian emergency management agencies deserved respect rather than dismissal. The broken equipment they'd given her was meant to ensure failure. Instead, it would become an opportunity to demonstrate that true expertise didn't depend on perfect tools. Sometimes the most important skills involved making inadequate resources work when failure wasn't an option. Tomorrow would determine whether she could maintain her cover while still achieving mission success. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Dr. Sarah Chen felt like herself again. The simulation alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at exactly 0500 hours, jolting the civilian emergency response teams from their final preparations. Dr. Sarah Chen had been awake for the past hour anyway, conducting a final inspection of the deliberately compromised equipment she'd been assigned. The chemical detection monitors displayed erratic readings even in clean air. The portable communication units crackled with static interference, and the emergency generators showed clear signs of fuel line tampering that would cause power failures at critical moments. Sarah strapped on her gear with methodical precision, noting each piece of sabotaged equipment, while mentally cataloging the workarounds she'd developed during her sleepless night of preparation. Around her, fellow FEMA coordinators fumbled with their own faulty gear, their frustration evident as malfunctioning equipment refused to operate according to specifications. "This stuff is garbage," muttered Tom Martinez, struggling with a handheld detection unit that couldn't maintain calibration for more than 30 seconds. "How are we supposed to coordinate anything with equipment that doesn't work?" Sarah glanced at Tom's device and immediately recognized the specific type of sabotage. Someone had carefully adjusted the internal components to create failures that would appear random but occur with devastating frequency during high-stress operations. It was sophisticated work that required both technical expertise and malicious intent. "Sometimes equipment fails under field conditions," she replied diplomatically. "The real test is how we adapt when our tools don't perform as expected." Colonel Walsh's voice crackled through the exercise communication system, cutting through the early morning confusion with military precision. "All participants, this is exercise control. The scenario has commenced. Multiple explosions have occurred at the Henderson Chemical Processing Facility. Initial reports indicate structural damage, mass casualties, and potential environmental contamination. Civilian emergency management teams will establish command posts at designated coordinates and begin response operations immediately." Sarah consulted her map, noting that the civilian command post locations had been positioned at maximum distance from the simulated disaster site. Military units would be operating from forward positions with direct access to the affected areas, while civilian teams would be coordinating from locations that required extended transportation times and complicated logistics. The setup was becoming more obvious by the minute. She joined her assigned team of 4 FEMA coordinators and 2 representatives from state emergency management agencies. Their vehicle, a converted van with emergency communications equipment, refused to start on the first 3 attempts. When the engine finally turned over, the communication array immediately began displaying error messages that suggested internal component failures. "Great," said Jennifer Walsh, a state coordinator from California who'd volunteered for the exercise to gain federal experience. "We're supposed to coordinate a major disaster response with equipment that belonged in a junkyard 3 years ago." Sarah took the driver's seat and began navigating toward their assigned command post, mentally calculating travel time while listening to radio chatter from military units already deploying to the disaster site. The contrast in equipment quality was stark. Military communications were clear and reliable, while civilian channels buzzed with static and intermittent failures. As they approached the command post location, Sarah could see the scope of the simulated disaster scenario. The exercise designers had created an impressively realistic chemical plant explosion, complete with smoke effects, simulated structural damage, and actor casualties displaying symptoms of chemical exposure. Military response teams were already establishing perimeters and beginning evacuation procedures with efficiency that reflected extensive training and superior equipment. The civilian command post consisted of 3 trailers positioned on a hillside approximately 2 miles from the disaster site. The distance would complicate visual assessment and extend response times, but Sarah recognized it as another deliberate disadvantage built into the exercise design. Inside the command trailer, she began setting up communication links while her teammates struggled with malfunctioning equipment. The primary communication array refused to establish stable connections. The backup system showed similar problems. And even basic telephone lines suffered from mysterious interference that hadn't existed during equipment checks the previous day. Control. This is Civilian Team Alpha requesting technical support for communication equipment failures. Tom Martinez spoke into his radio, frustration evident in his voice. Civilian Team Alpha. This is Control. Technical support is not available. During exercise scenarios, teams must adapt to equipment limitations using available resources. Sarah wasn't surprised by the response. Military exercises often included equipment failures as training elements, but the level of systematic sabotage affecting civilian teams went far beyond normal training parameters. Someone wanted to ensure that civilian emergency management capabilities appeared completely inadequate compared to military response efforts. She opened the primary communication unit and quickly identified the source of the interference. Simple component adjustments that could be corrected in minutes if you knew what to look for. But making those corrections would require technical knowledge that a typical FEMA coordinator wouldn't possess. While her teammates continued struggling with their assigned tasks, Sarah discreetly began implementing workarounds for the sabotaged equipment. She rerouted communication channels through backup systems that the saboteurs hadn't anticipated, adjusted detection equipment calibrations using manual override procedures, and jury-rigged power connections that bypassed the tampered fuel lines. Within 30 minutes, she had restored basic functionality to most of their equipment. Not perfect performance, but adequate capability for emergency coordination. Her teammates noticed the improvement, but attributed it to equipment settling, rather than deliberate intervention. "Thank God something's finally working," Jennifer said as her communication unit began receiving clear transmissions from field teams. "I was starting to think we'd have to coordinate this whole thing with smoke signals." Sarah continued monitoring radio chatter while establishing contact with various response elements. What she heard confirmed her assessment of the exercise's deliberate bias. Military units received immediate support for any equipment problems, while civilian requests for assistance were delayed or denied entirely. The scenario complications began escalating as morning progressed. Additional explosion simulations created new casualty sites that required immediate response. Environmental contamination spread beyond initial projections, threatening civilian population centers. Infrastructure damage complicated transportation routes and emergency access. Each new complication was announced through exercise control with clinical precision. But Sarah recognized the pattern. Every development was specifically designed to overwhelm civilian coordination capabilities while showcasing military adaptability and superior resources. Her teammates were beginning to show signs of stress as the scenario demands exceeded their training and equipment capabilities. Tom Martinez had given up trying to coordinate multi-agency response and was simply relaying information between military units. Jennifer Walsh was struggling to track casualty numbers using detection equipment that provided inconsistent readings. Sarah realized that passive observation was no longer an option. Her colleagues were failing not because of incompetence, but because they'd been systematically undermined by deliberate sabotage and impossible scenario demands. If she continued allowing the exercise to proceed according to the organizers' expectations, it would damage not just their individual careers, but the credibility of civilian emergency management agencies. She began taking a more active role in coordination efforts, quietly implementing response protocols that her colleagues hadn't learned in standard FEMA training. Instead of relying on the sabotage detection equipment, she began using environmental indicators and symptom analysis to assess contamination patterns. Rather than depending on unreliable communication systems, she established messenger relays and visual signal networks that functioned independently of electronic equipment. Most importantly, she started applying systematic triage and resource allocation techniques that maximized effectiveness despite limited capabilities. Her approach reflected training that went far beyond civilian emergency management courses, but she implemented it gradually enough that her teammates attributed the improvements to collective problem-solving rather than individual expertise. "Sarah, how did you know to establish that alternate communication network?" Jennifer asked as information flow began improving dramatically. "Standard protocol for electronic system failures," Sarah replied calmly. "When primary systems fail, you implement redundant capabilities using available resources." It was technically true, though the specific protocol she was implementing came from military CBRN response training rather than civilian emergency management courses. But her teammates didn't need to know that distinction. By midday, the civilian command post was operating with efficiency that clearly surprised the exercise observers. Military personnel who'd been monitoring civilian response efforts with barely concealed amusement were now paying serious attention to coordination activities that exceeded their expectations. Sarah noticed Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, the Deputy Exercise Director, standing outside the command trailer and speaking quietly into his radio. His expression suggested he was reporting developments that hadn't been anticipated in the exercise design. The scenario complications continued escalating throughout the afternoon, but Sarah's team was adapting to each new challenge with increasing effectiveness. When secondary explosions created additional casualty sites, they had messenger networks in place to coordinate response efforts. When environmental contamination spread beyond initial projections, they'd already established monitoring protocols that provided accurate assessment without relying on the sabotage detection equipment. Most impressively, they were achieving coordination between military and civilian response elements that the exercise designers clearly hadn't expected. Sarah's systematic approach to resource allocation and task delegation was enabling effective multi-agency cooperation despite the built-in institutional friction. "Civilian Team Alpha, this is exercise control," came the radio transmission that Sarah had been anticipating. "Please report your current operational status and resource requirements." Tom Martinez reached for the radio, but Sarah intercepted the communication. "Exercise control, this is Civilian Team Alpha. We have established effective command and control capabilities, implemented environmental monitoring protocols, and coordinated response efforts for all current scenario elements. We are prepared for additional complications as the scenario develops." The silence that followed her report lasted longer than normal radio protocol would suggest. When the response came, it carried a tone of surprise that Colonel Walsh was trying to conceal. "Copy, Civilian Team Alpha. Maintain current operations and prepare for scenario escalation." Sarah handed the radio back to Tom, who was staring at her with confusion and growing respect. "How did you manage to get everything organized so quickly?" "This morning we couldn't even establish basic communications. Systematic problem solving," she replied. "When you identify the core issues causing problems, you can develop workarounds that address multiple failures simultaneously." It was another technically accurate but incomplete explanation. What she'd actually done was apply specialized training in emergency response under extreme conditions, using techniques developed for situations where conventional equipment was unavailable or compromised. The afternoon brought the exercises. Most challenging scenario complications yet. A simulated secondary disaster created new casualty sites that required immediate evacuation. Chemical contamination reached levels that threatened civilian population centers beyond the exercise area. Infrastructure damage eliminated primary transportation routes and emergency access corridors. Each new development was clearly designed to overwhelm civilian response capabilities and demonstrate the superiority of military crisis management. But Sarah's team continued adapting to every challenge with effectiveness that surprised both their military counterparts and themselves. When evacuation routes were compromised, they established alternate transportation networks using civilian vehicles and local resources. When contamination levels exceeded detection equipment capabilities, they implemented protective protocols based on environmental indicators and symptom monitoring. When infrastructure damage eliminated communication networks, they maintained coordination through messenger relays and visual signaling systems. By late afternoon, something remarkable was happening. Instead of showcasing civilian inadequacy, the exercise was demonstrating that properly coordinated emergency management could achieve impressive results even under extreme resource constraints. Sarah was directing evacuation efforts from the command trailer when she noticed that military observers were no longer maintaining their professional distance. Several high-ranking officers had gathered outside the civilian command post, clearly monitoring operations that had exceeded their expectations. Colonel Walsh appeared at the trailer entrance, her expression reflecting curiosity rather than the condescending professionalism she'd displayed during the initial briefing. "Dr. Chen, could you step outside for a moment? I'd like to discuss your coordination approaches." Sarah followed Walsh away from the command trailer, noting the presence of several other military officers who were observing with intense interest. She recognized the look from her own military experience, the way senior leadership evaluated unexpected developments that required explanation. "Dr. Chen," Walsh began carefully, "your team's performance today has been significantly above expectations. For civilian emergency management capabilities, the coordination techniques you've implemented suggest training beyond standard FEMA protocols." Sarah had anticipated this conversation and prepared her response accordingly. "Colonel, we're applying systematic problem-solving approaches that emphasize adaptability when standard procedures prove insufficient. When equipment fails, you implement alternative methods using available resources. The specific alternative methods you've chosen suggest familiarity with military emergency response protocols," Walsh continued. "Your approach to environmental monitoring, resource allocation, and multi-agency coordination reflects specialized training that most civilian coordinators haven't received." The moment Sarah had been dreading for 3 years was arriving ahead of schedule. Her carefully maintained cover as a mediocre federal bureaucrat was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of military professionals who recognized expertise when they encountered it. "I've studied military emergency management techniques as part of my professional development," she said, which was technically true, though vastly understated. "Effective emergency response requires learning from multiple sources and adapting techniques from various disciplines." Colonel Walsh studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone trained to evaluate personnel under pressure. "Dr. Chen, what was your previous experience before joining FEMA?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge that couldn't be deflected with diplomatic non-answers. Sarah realized that her choice was between maintaining her cover and risking the failure of emergency response coordination that could save lives in future real disasters. "My background includes specialized training in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear emergency response," she said carefully. "I applied that knowledge today because the scenario demanded capabilities beyond standard civilian protocols." Walsh's expression shifted from curiosity to recognition. "CBRN training typically requires military clearance levels that exceed civilian access. Where did you receive that specialized education?" Sarah looked at the officers surrounding her, recognizing that her 3 years of anonymity were about to end. But as she considered her options, she realized that protecting her cover had become less important than demonstrating that civilian emergency management deserved respect rather than systematic undermining. Army 20th Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, Explosives Command, she said quietly. 8 years developing response protocols for weapons of mass destruction incidents. The silence that followed was profound. Walsh exchanged glances with the other officers, clearly processing information that explained everything they'd observed during the day's exercise. "Dr. Chen," Walsh said slowly, "you're telling me that a former military CBRN specialist has been working as a mid-level FEMA coordinator for the past 3 years?" "Yes, ma'am. And today, when presented with deliberately sabotaged equipment and impossible scenario demands, you implemented military-grade response protocols to achieve mission success, despite systematic attempts to ensure your failure." Sarah met Walsh's gaze directly. The equipment sabotage was obvious to anyone with technical training. The scenario complications were designed to overwhelm civilian capabilities. I adapted using available resources and applicable knowledge. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression reflecting amazement rather than suspicion. "Ma'am, are you saying you recognize that the exercise was rigged against civilian participants?" "The pattern was clear from the initial equipment assignments," Sarah replied. "But rather than accept failure, I implemented workarounds that allowed us to achieve mission objectives despite the constraints." Walsh was studying Sarah with new understanding. "Dr. Chen, your personnel file indicates standard civilian emergency management credentials. There's no mention of military CBRN specialization or the level of expertise you've demonstrated today." Sarah had known this moment would eventually arrive. Her specialized knowledge was too distinctive to hide indefinitely. And today's exercise had forced her to reveal capabilities that couldn't be explained by civilian training alone. "My military service ended 3 years ago when budget cuts eliminated specialized CBRN programs," she explained. "I joined FEMA to continue working in emergency management without the political complications that affected military assignments. And you've been operating below your capabilities ever since," Walsh concluded, "hiding expertise that could revolutionize civilian emergency response effectiveness." The assessment was accurate, though Sarah wouldn't have described her situation in exactly those terms. She'd been protecting herself from the scrutiny and expectations that came with acknowledging specialized military training. But the cost of that protection was becoming clear as she watched military officers recognize the potential of properly coordinated civilian emergency management. "Dr. Chen," Colonel Walsh said, her tone shifting from interrogation to something approaching respect, "would you be willing to discuss your background and today's performance with Pentagon emergency management specialists?" Sarah understood the implications of the request. Accepting would mean stepping back into a world of high stakes, decision-making and institutional scrutiny that she'd worked to escape. But declining would mean that the lessons learned during today's exercise would be buried rather than implemented. She thought about her teammates who were still coordinating response efforts with newfound confidence and effectiveness, about the broken equipment that they'd overcome through determination and improvised solutions, about the future disasters where civilian emergency management agencies would need to prove their competence rather than accept systematic marginalization. "Colonel," she said finally, "I'd be willing to discuss how today's exercise could inform improved coordination between military and civilian emergency response capabilities." It wasn't a complete commitment, but it was an acknowledgement that her 3 years of hiding had accomplished less than 1 day of demonstrating what civilian emergency management could achieve when properly supported and effectively coordinated. As the sun began setting over the Nevada desert, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed anonymity was ending. But instead of the exposure she'd feared, she was discovering that some knowledge was too valuable to keep hidden, and some expertise too important to waste on bureaucratic mediocrity. The broken equipment they'd given her to ensure failure had become the foundation for proving that civilian emergency management agencies deserve respect rather than sabotage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions about her future, but tonight she could take satisfaction in knowing that she'd proven civilian coordinators could excel even under impossible conditions. The exercise alarm that had begun the day sounded again, signaling the end of the simulation. But Sarah understood that something larger was just beginning. Her cover was blown, her expertise was exposed, and her quiet life of professional mediocrity was about to become significantly more complicated. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to finding out what happened next. 3 weeks after the Nevada exercise, Dr. Sarah Chen found herself sitting in a Pentagon conference room that she'd never expected to see again. The walls were lined with classified maps and emergency response protocols, while senior military officials and civilian agency directors filled leather chairs around a mahogany table that reflected decades of high-stakes decision-making. Her modest FEMA coordinator salary had never prepared her for meetings where individual choices affected national emergency preparedness policies. General Rebecca Morrison, the Pentagon's Director of Emergency Management Coordination, opened the session with clinical precision. Dr. Chen, your performance during the Nellis exercise has raised significant questions about current interagency coordination protocols. We've completed a comprehensive review of the exercise outcomes, and your response to deliberately compromised equipment exceeded all projections for civilian emergency management capabilities. Sarah had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this conversation, knowing that her exposure during the Nevada simulation would eventually lead to formal scrutiny from higher authorities. She'd reviewed every decision, analyzed every technique, and considered every possible explanation for capabilities that clearly exceeded her official credentials. "General," she replied carefully, "the exercise demonstrated that civilian emergency management agencies can achieve exceptional results when supported appropriately and allowed to implement adaptive response protocols." General Morrison leaned forward slightly, her expression reflecting both curiosity and skepticism. "Dr. Chen, the techniques you implemented during the exercise weren't standard civilian protocols. Your approach to environmental monitoring, resource allocation, and multi-agency coordination suggested military-level CBRN training that your personnel file doesn't reflect." The moment Sarah had been anticipating and dreading was finally arriving. Her carefully maintained cover as an unremarkable federal bureaucrat was being dissected by people with the authority and resources to uncover any background information that existed in government databases. "My previous military service included specialized training that I've continued applying in civilian emergency management roles," she said, which was accurate but deliberately incomplete. "According to our records," continued Colonel Patricia Hayes, the Pentagon's liaison for civilian agency coordination, "you served 8 years with the Army's 20th Chemical, Biological, Radiological, Nuclear, Explosives Command, developing response protocols for weapons of mass destruction incidents. Your expertise in specialized emergency response was classified at levels requiring congressional oversight to discuss." Sarah wasn't surprised that they'd accessed her complete military records. Pentagon security clearances provided access to information that civilian agencies couldn't obtain, and her performance during the exercise had clearly justified extensive background investigation. "That's correct," she acknowledged. "My military specialization focused on developing response capabilities for CBRN incidents that conventional emergency management protocols couldn't address." General Morrison consulted a thick folder before continuing. "Dr. Chen, your military service record indicates that you personally led response teams in situations involving chemical weapons deployment, nuclear material threats, and biological agent containment. You developed innovative decontamination techniques that are now standard protocol for military CBRN units worldwide. The general was reading from classified files that documented operations Sarah had hoped would remain buried forever. Missions in places that didn't appear on public maps, where her decisions had prevented mass casualty events that would have made international headlines. Those operations were classified, Sarah replied diplomatically. I'm not authorized to discuss specific details. You're authorized now, General Morrison said, sliding a document across the table. Temporary security clearance reinstatement, effective immediately. We need to understand exactly what capabilities you demonstrated during the Nevada exercise and how they could be implemented across civilian emergency management agencies. Sarah reviewed the clearance documentation, recognizing both opportunity and danger in the Pentagon's renewed interest in her expertise. Accepting would mean stepping back into a world of classified operations and high-stakes decision-making that she'd worked to escape. But declining would mean that the knowledge she'd spent years developing would remain buried rather than implemented. For public benefit. General, before I discuss my background further, I need to understand the Pentagon's intentions regarding civilian emergency management agencies. The Nevada exercise appeared designed to demonstrate civilian inadequacy rather than foster genuine interagency cooperation. The observation created visible tension around the conference table. Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably, while General Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral. Sarah had just accused the Pentagon of conducting exercises specifically intended to undermine civilian capabilities, which was politically sensitive regardless of its accuracy. Dr. Chen, General Morrison said after a prolonged pause, recent evaluations have identified significant gaps in emergency response coordination between military and civilian agencies. The Nevada exercise was designed to assess those gaps and identify improvement opportunities. Sarah interpreted the diplomatic language correctly. The Pentagon had been systematically demonstrating civilian agency inadequacy to justify increased military control over emergency response operations. But her unexpected success during the exercise had complicated that narrative. General, with respect, deliberately sabotaging civilian equipment to ensure failure doesn't assess genuine capabilities. It creates artificial failures that justify predetermined conclusions about agency effectiveness. The accusation hung in the air like live ammunition. Sarah was directly challenging Pentagon emergency management policies in a room full of officials who developed those policies. But her 3 years of hiding had taught her that protecting institutional reputations was less important than ensuring effective emergency response capabilities. General Morrison exchanged glances with Colonel Hayes before responding. Dr. Chen, are you suggesting that the Nevada exercise equipment failures were intentional rather than incidental? I'm stating that the equipment sabotage was sophisticated and systematic, targeting specific components that would cause failures during high-stress operations. The pattern was consistent across all civilian team assignments and clearly required technical expertise to implement. Sarah opened her briefcase and removed detailed documentation she'd prepared during the past 3 weeks. Photographs of sabotaged components, technical analysis of deliberate modifications, and timeline correlation showing that equipment failures occurred precisely when civilian teams were making progress. This analysis demonstrates that civilian team equipment was deliberately compromised to ensure failure, while military units received functional gear and immediate technical support for any problems that developed. The documentation was damning, providing clear evidence that the exercise had been rigged against civilian participants. But Sarah wasn't presenting it to embarrass the Pentagon officials. She was demonstrating that civilian emergency management agencies deserved evaluation based on actual capabilities rather than artificially created limitations. General Morrison reviewed the technical analysis with growing concern. As a career military officer, she understood the implications of conducting training exercises with predetermined outcomes. Such practices undermined the credibility of military assessments and damaged interagency relationships that were essential for effective emergency response. Dr. Chen, assuming your analysis is accurate, what would you recommend for future interagency training exercises? Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared comprehensive recommendations based on her military experience and 3 years of observing civilian emergency management operations. General, effective training requires realistic scenarios with functional equipment and genuine cooperation between agencies. The goal should be identifying actual capability gaps rather than creating artificial failures. She outlined a training framework that would test both military and civilian capabilities under realistic conditions, using functional equipment and scenarios based on actual disaster experiences rather than theoretical complications, designed to overwhelm specific agencies. Most importantly, she continued, training exercises should focus on developing complementary capabilities rather than demonstrating institutional superiority. Military and civilian agencies have different strengths that should be leveraged cooperatively rather than competitively. Colonel Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. Dr. Chen, your recommendations suggest extensive experience with multi-agency coordination under actual emergency conditions. Could you elaborate on that background? Sarah realized she'd reached the point where complete honesty was necessary. Her 3 years of hiding had accomplished nothing except wasting expertise that could benefit emergency response capabilities. The Pentagon officials clearly recognized her knowledge level, and attempting to minimize her background would only undermine her credibility. Colonel, my military service included developing response protocols for situations where conventional emergency management approaches were insufficient. I've coordinated multi-agency responses to chemical weapons incidents, nuclear material threats, and biological agent releases that required integration of military precision with civilian resource capabilities. She described operations that had never appeared in public records, missions where her coordination between military technical capabilities and civilian logistical resources had prevented mass casualty events. Each example demonstrated why effective emergency response required cooperation rather than competition between agencies. The Nevada exercise could have showcased how military technical expertise and civilian coordination capabilities could complement each other to achieve exceptional results, she concluded. Instead, it was designed to demonstrate civilian inadequacy, which serves no constructive purpose for actual emergency preparedness. General Morrison had been taking notes throughout Sarah's presentation, clearly recognizing both the expertise being demonstrated and the criticism of current Pentagon policies. Dr. Chen, your analysis suggests that civilian emergency management agencies possess capabilities that our current assessment methods haven't accurately measured. Exactly, General. When civilian agencies are given functional equipment and realistic scenarios, they can achieve results that equal or exceed military performance in specific areas. But those capabilities are never demonstrated when exercises are designed to ensure civilian failure. The general consulted her notes before asking the question Sarah had been expecting. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to design and implement a new interagency training framework that accurately assesses both military and civilian emergency response capabilities? Sarah understood the implications of the offer. Accepting would mean taking responsibility for revolutionizing how military and civilian agencies prepared for emergency response operations. It would require her to step back into a world of high-stakes decision-making and institutional politics that she'd worked to escape. But it would also mean that her knowledge and experience could serve something larger than bureaucratic survival. The techniques she'd developed through years of specialized training could be implemented to improve emergency response capabilities across all agencies. General, I'd be willing to develop training protocols that provide accurate assessment of interagency coordination capabilities, provided that the Pentagon is committed to genuine cooperation rather than institutional competition. General. Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting. Dr. Chen, the Pentagon's primary mission is national security, which requires the most effective emergency response capabilities possible. If civilian agencies can demonstrate superior performance in specific areas, we want to understand and leverage those capabilities. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering technical details and implementation timelines for the new training framework Sarah would develop. But the fundamental shift had already occurred. Instead of hiding her expertise to maintain anonymity, she was being asked to apply her knowledge to improve emergency preparedness across all agencies. 6 months later, Sarah found herself at the Pine Ridge Federal Training Facility in Colorado, overseeing the first interagency exercise conducted according to her new protocols. Military and civilian teams worked with identical equipment and faced scenarios based on actual disaster experiences rather than theoretical complications designed to favor specific agencies. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. When given functional equipment and realistic challenges, civilian emergency management coordinators demonstrated capabilities that impressed their military counterparts. Simultaneously, military technical expertise enhanced civilian coordination efforts in ways that neither agency could achieve independently. Dr. Chen, said Captain Maria Santos, a Navy emergency response specialist who participated in the exercise, this approach to training has completely changed my understanding of civilian emergency management capabilities. When we work together instead of competing, the results are extraordinary. Sarah watched military and civilian personnel sharing techniques in developing collaborative solutions to complex emergency scenarios. After 3 years of hiding from recognition and avoiding responsibility, she was finally seeing her knowledge implemented for constructive purposes. The Pine Ridge exercise became the foundation for a new approach to emergency response training that spread throughout federal agencies. Instead of demonstrating institutional superiority, exercises focused on developing collaborative capabilities that leverage the unique strengths of different organizations. Sarah's reputation as the architect of this transformation brought recognition that she'd spent years avoiding. Emergency management professionals from across the country sought her consultation on training programs and coordination protocols. Military commanders requested her input on civilian agency capabilities. Congressional committees asked for her testimony on emergency preparedness policies. But the recognition that mattered most came from her former FEMA colleagues, who were finally being evaluated based on their actual capabilities rather than artificially created limitations. Tom Martinez, who'd struggled with sabotaged equipment during the Nevada exercise, became one of the most effective emergency coordinators in the federal system when given proper support and realistic challenges. Sarah, he said, during a coordination meeting for hurricane response preparations, you showed us that we were capable of much more than we'd been allowed to demonstrate. The Nevada exercise was a setup, but it became the foundation for proving what we could really accomplish. Jennifer Walsh, the state coordinator who'd participated in the original exercise, had been promoted to regional director and was implementing Sarah's training protocols across multiple states. Dr. Chen, the techniques you developed have revolutionized how we approach multi-agency coordination. We're achieving results that would have been impossible under the old competitive approaches. The transformation extended beyond training exercises to actual emergency response operations. When Hurricane Sophia struck the Gulf Coast, military and civilian agencies implemented collaborative protocols that Sarah had developed, achieving coordination efficiency that reduced response times and improved resource allocation. During the response, General Morrison contacted Sarah directly to report on the operation's success. Dr. Chen, the coordination protocols you developed have saved countless lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure of emergency response systems. Your work has fundamentally improved our national emergency preparedness capabilities. Sarah coordinated the hurricane response from a federal emergency operations center, applying techniques she developed through years of specialized training to manage one of the largest natural disaster responses in recent history. But instead of operating alone under impossible pressure, she was leading collaborative efforts that leveraged the strengths of multiple agencies. 2 years after the Nevada exercise that had exposed her hidden expertise, Sarah received an offer that represented the culmination of her transformation from anonymous bureaucrat to recognized authority on emergency response coordination. Dr. Chen, said Secretary of Homeland Security Patricia Williams during a meeting in Washington, the President has approved the creation of a new National Emergency Response Coordination Center, and we'd like you to serve as its first director. This position would oversee all federal emergency response coordination and establish protocols for state and local agency integration. The offer represented everything Sarah had avoided for 3 years. High-profile responsibility, political scrutiny, and decision-making authority that would affect emergency response capabilities across the entire country. But it also represented an opportunity to implement her knowledge at the highest levels of government and ensure that future disasters would be met with coordinated, effective responses. Secretary Williams, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to understand the scope of authority and independence that would be provided. Effective emergency coordination requires freedom from political interference and bureaucratic limitations. Dr. Chen, this position would report directly to the President during emergency operations and would have authority to coordinate all federal agencies during disaster response. Your demonstrated expertise and innovative approaches to interagency cooperation make you uniquely qualified for this responsibility. Sarah accepted the position, understanding that her years of hiding were officially over and her expertise would now be applied at the highest levels of government. The broken equipment that was supposed to ensure her failure had become the foundation for revolutionizing federal emergency response capabilities. The National Emergency Response Coordination Center became operational 6 months later, housed in a state-of-the-art facility that integrated military technical capabilities with civilian coordination expertise. Sarah's staff included both military and civilian emergency management professionals, working together to develop response protocols that leverage the unique strengths of different agencies. Her first major test came when a chemical plant explosion in Texas created exactly the type of emergency that had been simulated during the Nevada exercise. But instead of competing agencies working with sabotaged equipment, coordinated teams implemented collaborative protocols, using the best available resources from all participating organizations. The response was so effective that it became a case study for emergency management programs worldwide. Lives were saved that would have been lost under previous coordination protocols. Environmental damage was minimized through rapid containment efforts. Economic impact was reduced through efficient resource allocation and streamlined decision-making processes. Dr. Chen, said the plant manager whose facility had been affected by the accident, your coordination saved our community from what could have been a catastrophe. The way different agencies worked together was unlike anything we'd ever seen. Sarah stood in the Emergency Operations Center, watching real-time coordination between dozens of agencies that were implementing protocols she developed through years of hidden expertise and painful experience. The techniques that had been tested under impossible conditions were now serving their intended purpose of protecting lives and communities. Her phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Walsh, who'd first recognized her capabilities during the Nevada exercise. Dr. Chen, congratulations on another successful emergency response operation. You've proven that the ghost of competence was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. Sarah smiled at the reference to her years of anonymity, understanding that her transformation from hidden expert to national authority had been worth the personal costs involved. The broken equipment that was meant to ensure her failure had become the catalyst for proving that civilian emergency management agencies deserved respect rather than systematic undermining. The evening news coverage of the Texas response featured interviews with emergency responders who praised the coordination they'd experienced. "We've never seen agencies work together so effectively," said a local fire chief. "Everyone knew their role, communication was seamless, and resources were allocated exactly where they were needed." Sarah watched the coverage from her office, feeling satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with knowing that her expertise was finally serving its intended purpose. For 3 years, she'd hidden knowledge that could save lives. Now that knowledge was being implemented to protect communities across the entire country. The faded military credentials that she'd kept hidden were now displayed prominently in her office, not as trophies of past achievements, but as documentation of the foundation that had prepared her for current responsibilities. The broken equipment from Nevada sat on her desk as a reminder that adversity often revealed capabilities that comfort never tested. Dr. Sarah Chen had learned that some expertise was too valuable to waste on comfortable anonymity. Some knowledge was too important to hide behind bureaucratic mediocrity. And some challenges were too significant to meet with anything less than complete commitment to excellence. The ghost had emerged from hiding and found her purpose in serving something larger than personal security. Tomorrow would bring new emergencies and fresh challenges, but tonight she could take satisfaction in knowing that her journey from sabotaged equipment to national leadership had proven that legends weren't always announced with fanfare. Sometimes they were revealed through response to impossible circumstances and commitment to serving others, regardless of personal cost. 5 years after the Nevada exercise that had shattered her carefully constructed anonymity, Dr. Sarah Chen stood before a joint session of Congress, preparing to deliver testimony that would fundamentally reshape how America approached emergency response coordination. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with anticipation as senators and representatives took their seats, many of them having witnessed firsthand the transformation of federal emergency management under her leadership. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was testifying about the same coordination failures that had led to her initial assignment to the rigged Nevada exercise. Deputy Director Hoffman, who had selected her for that exercise expecting public humiliation, now served as a regional coordinator under protocols she had developed. His career had actually benefited from the very expertise he had tried to sabotage, though he still seemed uncomfortable acknowledging her authority during interagency meetings. Chairman Senator Patricia Valdez called the session to order with the gravity that accompanied discussions of national security implications. "Dr. Chen, your innovative approaches to emergency response coordination have been credited with saving thousands of lives and preventing economic losses estimated in the billions. Today, we'd like you to share insights about the future of federal emergency management and the lessons learned from recent operational successes." Sarah adjusted her notes, containing data from dozens of emergency responses that had been coordinated through her National Emergency Response Coordination Center. Each operation had validated techniques she'd first demonstrated with sabotaged equipment in the Nevada desert, proving that adversity often revealed capabilities that comfort never tested. "Thank you, Chairman Valdez. Over the past 5 years, we've learned that effective emergency response depends not on institutional competition, but on collaborative capabilities that leverage the unique strengths of different agencies. When military technical expertise combines with civilian coordination capabilities, the results exceed what either sector can achieve independently." She clicked to her first presentation slide, showing response time comparisons between old competitive protocols and new collaborative approaches. Hurricane Sophia response times were reduced by 43% compared to previous storms of similar magnitude. The Texas chemical plant incident achieved containment in 60% less time than historical averages for comparable emergencies. Most significantly, interagency friction has been virtually eliminated through protocols that emphasize cooperation rather than territorial competition. Representative Marcus Thompson, a former military officer who had initially opposed civilian agency expansion, leaned forward with obvious interest. Dr. Chen, your success seems to contradict decades of analysis suggesting that civilian agencies lack the technical capabilities necessary for complex emergency response operations. How do you explain this discrepancy? Sarah had anticipated this question, understanding that her transformation of civilian emergency management capabilities challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional competencies. Representative Thompson, civilian agencies have always possessed substantial capabilities that previous assessment methods failed to measure accurately. When agencies are evaluated using functional equipment and realistic scenarios, their performance often equals or exceeds military standards in coordination, resource allocation, and community integration. She advanced to documentation from the Pine Ridge training exercises, showing comparative performance data that had surprised even her most optimistic projections. Civilian coordinators consistently demonstrate superior capabilities in areas requiring local knowledge, community trust, and resource improvisation. Military units excel in technical implementation and systematic execution. Collaborative protocols allow each sector to contribute their strengths while mitigating individual limitations. Senator Rebecca Martinez, who chaired the Homeland Security Subcommittee, consulted her notes before asking the question Sarah had been expecting throughout her congressional preparation. Dr. Chen, your background includes specialized military training that significantly exceeds typical civilian credentials. How can your success be replicated by coordinators without similar expertise? The question touched on Sarah's ongoing concern about the sustainability of improvements she had implemented. Her specialized knowledge had been essential for developing new protocols, but long-term success required training programs that could transfer those capabilities to personnel without military CBRN backgrounds. Senator Martinez, the techniques we've developed are based on systematic approaches that can be taught through structured training programs. We've established the National Emergency Response Training Institute, which provides civilian coordinators with capabilities previously available only through specialized military education. Graduates of this program have achieved results comparable to my initial demonstrations. She described the training institute that had been constructed adjacent to the National Emergency Response Coordination Center, featuring realistic simulation, facilities and curriculum developed by both military and civilian experts. The institute has trained over 800 emergency coordinators who are now implementing collaborative protocols in all 50 states. Their performance validates that these capabilities can be transferred effectively through proper education and experience. Representative Sarah Kim, whose district had been affected by the recent earthquake response Sarah had coordinated, spoke with personal conviction about the improvements she had witnessed. Dr. Chen, during the San Andreas earthquake response, coordination between agencies was unlike anything our communities had experienced previously. Local officials consistently praised the integration of federal resources with state and local capabilities. Can you explain how this integration is achieved? Sarah smiled, remembering the earthquake response that had tested every protocol she had developed over the past 5 years. Representative Kim, effective integration requires understanding that each level of government possesses unique capabilities and limitations. Federal agencies provide technical resources and systemic coordination, State agencies bridge federal capabilities with regional knowledge. Local agencies contribute community connections and immediate response capabilities. She outlined the layered coordination approach that had evolved from her initial work, showing how information and resources flowed between organizational levels without bureaucratic bottlenecks or territorial conflicts. The key insight is that emergency response isn't hierarchical. It's collaborative, with each participant contributing specialized capabilities to achieve collective effectiveness. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering technical aspects of coordination protocols, budget implications of expanded training programs, and legislative requirements for implementing Sarah's approaches across all federal agencies. But the underlying theme remained consistent. Expertise properly applied could transform institutional capabilities in ways that benefited everyone involved. During the lunch recess, Sarah walked through the Capitol building corridors where photographs commemorated decades of American leadership during national crises. She paused before a display documenting Hurricane Katrina, remembering the coordination failures that had motivated her initial interest in emergency management before her military specialization had taken her in different directions. Her phone buzzed with updates from the National Emergency Response Coordination Center, where her staff was monitoring several developing situations that might require federal intervention. A wildfire in Oregon was approaching communities that had been evacuated using protocols she had developed. A chemical spill in the Great Lakes was being contained through multi-agency coordination that had become standard procedure. And offshore, hurricane was being tracked by integrated monitoring systems that provided unprecedented accuracy for evacuation planning. Each situation represented routine implementation of techniques that had been considered revolutionary just 5 years ago. The broken equipment that was supposed to demonstrate her inadequacy had become the foundation for transforming how America prepared for and responded to emergencies. Dr. Chen approached Senator Valdez during the recess. "Your presentation has been impressive, but I'm curious about something not covered in the formal testimony. How did you maintain motivation during the years when your expertise was underutilized?" Many professionals would have become discouraged by institutional limitations. Sarah considered the question carefully, understanding that the senator was asking about personal resilience as much as professional development. "Senator, during those years I focused on learning how civilian agencies operated and understanding the barriers that prevented effective coordination. The time wasn't wasted. It was preparation for implementing solutions that addressed real institutional challenges rather than theoretical problems." She explained how her 3 years of bureaucratic anonymity had taught her lessons about civilian agency culture that proved essential for developing collaborative protocols. Military efficiency doesn't translate directly to civilian environments. Community trust, political sensitivity, and resource constraints require different approaches that I could only understand through extended civilian experience. The afternoon session focused on implementation timelines for expanding Sarah's protocols to international emergency response coordination. NATO allies had requested training in collaborative techniques that had proven so effective during domestic operations. Several developing nations wanted assistance establishing emergency response capabilities that could integrate military precision with civilian coordination. Dr. Chen asked Representative James Wilson, who chaired the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, "International implementation of your protocols could significantly enhance global emergency response capabilities. Are you prepared to lead efforts that extend beyond domestic applications?" Sarah had been anticipating international expansion since her protocols had achieved consistent success in domestic operations. Representative Wilson, emergency response challenges increasingly cross national boundaries. Climate change, cyber, terrorism, and pandemic threats require coordination capabilities that transcend individual countries. The collaborative approaches we've developed could be adapted for international implementation. She outlined preliminary discussions with allied nations whose emergency management agencies were interested in joint training programs and shared resource coordination. International collaboration would enhance American emergency response capabilities while contributing to global security and humanitarian effectiveness. The hearing concluded with bipartisan agreement to expand funding for Sarah's National Emergency Response Training Institute and authorization for international collaboration programs. But for Sarah, the real victory was represented by the transformation in how congressional leaders discussed emergency management. Instead of focusing on institutional competition and budget allocation, the conversation emphasized collaborative effectiveness and shared capabilities. That evening, Sarah returned to her office in the National Emergency Response Coordination Center, where her staff was conducting routine monitoring of potential emergency situations across the country. The facility operated around the clock, integrating information from dozens of agencies and maintaining readiness for immediate deployment of coordinated response capabilities. Major Patricia Santos, her deputy director who had served with distinction during multiple emergency responses, approached with updates on current operations. Dr. Chen, the Oregon wildfire is contained ahead of schedule due to coordination between Forest Service, National Guard, and local volunteer departments. The Great Lakes chemical spill has been neutralized with no environmental damage beyond initial impact areas. The offshore hurricane has weakened significantly, but we're maintaining evacuation readiness for potentially affected communities. Sarah reviewed the operational reports, noting the routine efficiency with which complex emergencies were being managed through collaborative protocols that had become standard procedure. Major Santos, excellent coordination across all operations. The integration between agencies continues to exceed our most optimistic projections. She walked through the operations center, observing personnel from multiple agencies working side by side with the seamless cooperation that had replaced the territorial competition she remembered from her early FEMA experience. Military technical specialists collaborated with civilian coordinators to develop response options that neither group could achieve independently. Federal resources were being allocated through state and local agencies that understood community needs and political sensitivities. Her office overlooked the training facilities where the next generation of emergency coordinators were learning collaborative techniques through realistic simulations that tested actual capabilities rather than creating artificial failures. Unlike the Nevada exercise that had exposed her hidden expertise, these training programs were designed to develop competence rather than demonstrate inadequacy. The broken equipment from Nevada remained on her desk, serving as a reminder that adversity often revealed capabilities that comfort never tested. But surrounding that reminder were photographs from emergency responses where her protocols had saved lives and protected communities. Children rescued from flood zones through coordinated evacuation efforts. Families reunited after earthquake response operations. Communities rebuilt through integrated federal, state, and local collaboration. Sarah's phone chimed with a message from Tom Martinez, her former FEMA colleague who now directed emergency response operations for the entire Western region. Dr. Chen just finished coordinating response to a multi-state earthquake that would have overwhelmed our capabilities under the old protocols. Everything worked exactly as you designed it. Thank you for showing us what we were really capable of achieving. Similar messages arrived throughout the evening from coordinators across the country who were implementing techniques that had been developed from her initial demonstration with sabotaged equipment. Each success validated her decision to emerge from anonymity and apply her expertise for constructive purposes rather than comfortable mediocrity. The recognition that had initially frightened her had become the foundation for transforming American emergency response capabilities. Congressional testimony that she had once avoided was now routine communication about ongoing improvements and future developments. Media attention that had seemed threatening was now opportunities to educate the public about emergency preparedness and community resilience. But the satisfaction that mattered most came from knowing that her knowledge was serving its intended purpose of protecting lives and communities. The specialized training that had prepared her for weapons of mass destruction incidents was being applied to natural disasters, industrial accidents, and terrorist threats that affected ordinary Americans in their daily lives. Dr. Sarah Chen had learned that legends weren't always announced with fanfare. Sometimes they emerged through response to impossible circumstances and commitment to serving others regardless of personal cost. The ghost had found her purpose in proving that broken equipment couldn't break determined spirits, that sabotage systems couldn't sabotage genuine expertise, and that hidden capabilities could serve something larger than individual security. When applied with courage and conviction, tomorrow would bring new emergencies and fresh challenges. But tonight she could take satisfaction in knowing that her journey from anonymous bureaucrat to national leader had proven that adversity often revealed the very capabilities needed to overcome it. The broken equipment that was supposed to ensure her failure had become the foundation for success that exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.